Mail-order bride lied she could cook. She burned every meal. Cowboy hired her a cook and stayed. The bread came out black on the bottom and raw in the middle, and I remember standing in the doorway of my own kitchen holding a wedge of it that was somehow both burnt and wet, thinking I had married a woman who could not tell fire from water. Her name was Adeline Marsh. She'd come off the eastbound from Cheyenne 3 days before with a single trunk and a letter in her own hand that said, plain as anything, "I'm an experienced cook and keeper of a household." I'd read that letter 40 times on the ride to meet her, the paper gone soft at the folds, and I'd pictured a woman who'd know what to do with a side of beef and a Dutch oven. I got a woman who burned water. I am not exaggerating that. I watched her do it. Set a pot to boil and walked off to do something else and came back to a pot gone dry and the bottom scorched black, smoke curling up off it like the kitchen itself was angry at her. I didn't say anything that first week. A man doesn't not write off. You marry a stranger off a letter and a photograph. You owe her some grace while you both figure out what you've gotten into. So I ate the burnt bread and the gray meat and the beans that came out hard as gravel because she hadn't soaked them right. And I said, "Thank you, ma'am. This is fine," because my mother raised me to say that whether it was true or not. It was not true, not once in 3 weeks. I run the Bar K alone, ran it alone, I should say, before her 600 head and 4 hired men, and a foreman's house that hadn't had a woman in it since my own mother died 11 years back. I rode off to the agency in Denver because I was 38 years old and tired in a way that wasn't about the work. Tired of eating standing up at the stove with my hat still on. Tired of a house that only had my own boots in it. I told myself I wanted a wife. What I wanted, if I'm honest with you now, was somebody else's voice in the rooms. What I got was somebody who couldn't cook a potato. The thing that finally cracked me wasn't even the cooking. It was the morning I came in from checking the north fence line, hands half frozen, hungry enough to eat my own glove, and found her crying at the table over a skillet of eggs that had gone to black rubber. Not loud crying. Quiet, with her back straight and her jaw set like she was furious at herself and ashamed both, and trying hard not to let either one show. I stood in the doorway with my hat dripping snowmelt on the floor, and I said, "Adeline." She didn't turn around. "I know," she said. "I know they're ruined. That's the 4th pan this week. I know that too." I came in and sat down across from her, and I looked at those eggs, black and curled up at the edges like burnt paper, and something in me that had been holding tight for 3 weeks just let go, and I said, "Your letter said you could cook." She looked up at me then, gray eyes red-rimmed, and under the shame there was something else, something with some iron in it. "My letter said a lot of things, Mr. Kendrick." That's my name, Thomas Kendrick. She'd taken to calling me Mr. Kendrick like we were business partners instead of married, and that needled me more than the eggs did, if I'm being truthful. "Such as," I said. "Such as that I had family money and was coming west for adventure instead of because my father gambled away everything we had, including the roof. And I was 26 years old with no husband and no prospects and a choice between this and my uncle's house in Ohio, where he looks at me the way men look at a horse they're thinking about selling." She said all that flat, fast, like she'd practiced not crying while she said it. "I can sew. I can read a ledger better than most bank clerks. I can ride. I cannot cook, Mr. Kendrick. I have never had to. We always had a Mrs. Prout for that, and Mrs. Prout is in Ohio along with everything else I lost. And I lied to you in that letter because I did not think a rancher in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, would marry a woman for her penmanship." The kitchen was quiet after that, except for the stove ticking as it cooled. I want to tell you I had some fine and generous thought right then, some moment where my heart opened up like a door. I did not. What I thought, sitting there hungry with burnt egg smell in my nose, was that I'd been swindled, same as if I'd bought a horse that turned out to be lame. I was angry. I'll say that plain because there's no use pretending a man doesn't get angry when he feels lied to. But I looked at her hands. They were shaking, just slightly, around the edge of that ruined skillet, like she expected me to do something with my own hands that she wouldn't be able to take back. And I thought about Mrs. Prout and the uncle in Ohio who looked at her like a horse for sale, and something about that softened the anger into something else, something I didn't have a name for yet. "Can you ride?" I said. She blinked. "What?" "You said you can ride. Can you, or was that another Mrs. Prout situation?" "I can ride," she said, and there was a little fire come back into her voice. "I've ridden since I was 6. "Fine," I said, and I stood up, and I went and got my coat, which was still wet, and I said, "Get yours, we're going to town." She thought I was taking her to the stage. I could see it on her face, that bracing up look people get when they think they're about to lose something. She didn't say it. She just got her coat and her gloves and came out and stood by the wagon with her chin up, ready to be sent back to Ohio with whatever dignity she could carry with her. I didn't say where we were going until we were near there. Fort Apache Crossing, the little settlement 8 miles south, where there was a mercantile and a church, and not much else, except there was a widow there, Mrs. Iris Tavria, who ran a boarding house and was known up and down that stretch of country as the best cook between Cheyenne and the Black Hills. Her stew alone had men riding 4 hours for a bowl of it. I pulled the wagon up outside her place, and Adeline looked at me, confused now instead of braced. "I'm not putting you on a stage," I said. "I'm hiring you a cook." She stared at me like I'd spoken Cheyenne dialect at her. "I can't have my hands going hungry," I said, which was true but wasn't the real reason, and some part of me suspects she knew that even then. "Mrs. Tavria comes out 3 days a week, cooks ahead, teaches you what she can in between if you want it. You don't want it, that's your business too. But nobody in my house goes hungry on my account, not even on account of a wife who can't cook. You're not sending me back." "Did I say I was sending you back?" "You drove me to town without saying where." "I drive places without narrating my whole route, ma'am. That's just how a man drives a wagon." She almost smiled. I caught the edge of it before she put it away. "You could have just told me." "I could have," I agreed. "Wanted to see your face when you thought I might." That was a meaner thing to say than I meant it, or maybe I meant it exactly that mean. I'm still not sure all these years later. But she laughed, short and surprised, like it had been shook out of her. And that was the first time I heard her laugh, and I remember thinking it was a better sound than I'd expected out of a woman who cried quiet over burnt eggs. Mrs. Tavria was a stout woman with forearms like a blacksmith and no patience for foolishness, and she took one look at Adeline and said, "City girl," not a question, and Adeline said, "Yes, ma'am," and Mrs. Tavria said, "Well, you've got hands, that's a start, most of them I get sent don't even have that," and put her to work right there shelling peas while we talked terms. I paid Mrs. Tavria out of the cattle money I'd put aside for a second hand I hadn't hired yet. That's a fact I never told Adeline, not for years. I'd rather have an underfed crew through till spring than a wife who felt like a failure every single day at her own stove. A man doesn't say a thing like that out loud. You just do it and let it sit there as a fact in the world. The arrangement worked better than I let on at the time. Mrs. Tavria came 3 days a week and cooked enough to carry us through, and the other days Adeline cooked herself, badly at first, then less badly, then over the slow turn of that winter actually fine. Not fancy, but fine, eggs that didn't curl up black, bread that rose, a stew eventually that I ate 2 bowls of without being polite about it, just hungry and glad. But that's the cooking, and the cooking was never really the thing. I want to tell you about the thing. The thing was watching her learn to do something she was bad at, in front of a man, without quitting. I have known men, grown men, hard men, men who'd face down a stampede without blinking, who could not stand to be bad at something in front of another person. They'd rather not try at all than try and be seen failing. I've been that man myself, plenty of times. But Adeline burned that bread, and burned the next loaf, and the one after that, and stood in my kitchen with flour on her sleeves and her jaw set, and tried again, every single time, with Mrs. Tavria's voice in her ear and her own stubbornness driving her hands. I started to notice that. I started to notice it more than I noticed the food. There was a night in February. I remember it was February because the wind that month was the kind that finds every gap in a wall, when one of my hands, a young one named Birdwell, said something at supper about how the cook hadn't been out that week and the bread showed it. Said it with a grin like it was nothing, just talk between men. Adeline was at the stove with her back to us, and I saw her shoulders go stiff. I put my fork down. "Birdwell." He looked at me. "You eat what's put in front of you on my table, and you eat it grateful, or you eat standing up out by the bunkhouse where I don't have to watch you do it." The table went quiet. Birdwell mumbled something that passed for an apology. Adeline didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders come down some, just a little, like a held breath let out slow. She didn't thank me for it. Not that night. We weren't at a place yet where she'd have known how, or I'd have known how to be thanked, both of us still circling each other like 2 horses put in a paddock together that hadn't decided yet if they were going to fight or settle. But later that week I came in from the barn and found a pie on the table. An actual pie, apples from the cellar, crust that held its shape, and she didn't say a word about it. Just nodded toward it like there and went back to her mending. I ate 2 pieces standing up at the counter and didn't say much either. Some things don't need saying. I think we both knew what that pie was for. Spring came on hard that year, the way it does in that country. Mud to the axles and the creek running fast and brown. We lost a calf to a late blizzard in March. A bad one. A cow I'd had eyes on since she was born, and I came in that night not hungry at all, just hollowed out the particular way a rancher gets hollowed out by a death he could have maybe prevented with 1 more hour of watching. Adeline was at the table mending a shirt of mine by lamplight. She looked up and read my face. She'd gotten good at reading my face by then, better than I liked to admit, and she didn't ask me what was wrong. She just got up and put a plate together. Ham and biscuits she'd made that morning, good biscuits now, real ones, and set it down in front of me, and sat back down across the table and kept sewing, and let me eat in the kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything of a man. "Lost the Hereford calf," I said eventually, not looking up from the plate. "The one with the white face." I looked up, surprised she knew which one. I hadn't thought she paid that close attention to the herd, to which cow was which, to anything outside that kitchen. "You told me about her in November," Adeline said. "Said she'd make a good mother someday." I had told her that. I'd forgotten I had. Some night at this same table, talking the way a man does when his wife's listening even if he doesn't think much of it at the time, and she'd kept it, filed it away somewhere. "She would have," I said. "I'm sorry, Thomas." First time she'd used my given name. I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, a shift you feel on your skin before you can name what's different. I didn't say anything clever back. I just nodded and ate my biscuit and felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight since November. Tight maybe since my mother died 11 years before that. Tight since I'd started believing a man like me, plain, hard-handed, more comfortable with cattle than people. Wasn't the kind of man whose calf loss anybody bothered remembering details about. That was twist A starting to turn, if you want to call it that, though nobody in that kitchen was calling it anything. I'd married her thinking I needed somebody to cook and keep the house, and what I was finding out, slow as spring mud, was that I needed somebody to remember the name of a dead calf and the shape of my face on a bad night. The cooking, it turned out, was never going to be the thing that made a marriage. It was just the thing that had nearly broken it before either of us figured out what the real thing was. I should tell you about her temper too, because she had one, and I don't want you thinking she was some soft, grateful creature who just needed a man's kindness to bloom. She was not that. She had a tongue on her that could take the hide off a man twice her size, and she used it on me plenty that first year, mostly when I was being the particular kind of stubborn that ranching men get. The kind that doesn't ask for help and doesn't say when something's wrong and expects everybody around him to just read his mind through sheer force of silence. There was a fight, a real one, not a spat, in June, when I came down with a fever from a cut that had gone bad on my forearm, gotten it on a fence wire and ignored it the way you do, kept working through it, told myself it was nothing. And by the time Adeline noticed the red streaking up toward my elbow, I was sweating through my shirt and half out of my head. She did not handle that gently. She hauled me into a chair, cut the shirt sleeve clean off with a pair of shears, and while she was lancing the wound herself, because the nearest doctor was 11 miles and I was in no shape to ride, she gave me the kind of talking, to I have not had since my mother was alive to give them. "You are the stubbornest man God ever put breath into," she said, working the wound with hands that were shaking with anger more than fear. "And if you die of blood poisoning because you were too proud to say your arm hurt, Thomas Kendrick, I will never forgive you. Do you understand me? I came out here on a lie and built a whole life on top of it, and I am not doing all that work just to bury you because you wouldn't say 4 words, my arm is hurting." I was too sick and too startled to say much back. I remember laughing, which hurt, and saying something like, "Didn't know you'd built a whole life, thought you were still figuring out biscuits." And she said something unrepeatable about my biscuit's opinion and kept right on working that wound, steady-handed despite the shaking voice, because whatever else was true about her, she did not quit on a thing once she'd put her hands to it. Not bread, not me. The fever broke 2 days later. She didn't leave that chair beside the bed the whole time, slept in it sitting up. I found out after because Mrs. Tavria told me, since Adeline never would have. I woke up the second night to find her hand on my forehead, checking the heat of it, and her eyes were closed. And I lay there a long while not moving, watching her sleep sitting upright in a hard chair because she wouldn't leave me, and I thought, this is the woman I married. Not the woman who lied about the cooking. This one. The one with her hands still on my forehead 3 nights running. I want to be straight with you about something, because this isn't a story where everything got easy after that. It didn't. We had hard years after, same as anybody. A drought in the 3rd year that nearly took the herd. A miscarriage in the 4th that we did not talk about for a long time, that I think broke something in both of us that took its own slow time mending, the way those things do, with nobody to blame and nowhere to put the grief except into each other, which we did, badly some days and better other days. Money was tight more often than it was easy. I was not always patient. She was not always soft. I don't tell you this to make the story sadder than it needs to be. I tell you because a marriage that's worth anything isn't the kind where the trouble stops once the right 2 people find each other. It's the kind where the trouble keeps coming, and the 2 people keep choosing to stand in it together anyway. What I will tell you is the morning that mattered most to me, out of all the mornings in 41 years, because you asked me once, a long while back, what made me really know, and I gave you some answer about the pie or the fever, and those are true, but they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is this. It was the 5th winter. We did 2 good calving seasons in a row by then, the herd built back up past what it had been before the drought, and I'd finally hired that second hand I'd been meaning to hire since before I ever wrote to the agency in Denver. Adeline was 31 that winter, and a fine cook by then, genuinely fine. Women came from 2 ranches over to ask her for her bread recipe, which still made me laugh some nights remembering that first black loaf. I came in from a long day moving cattle to the south pasture, frozen through, boots heavy with mud and ice, and the house smelled like roast and wood smoke, and there was lamplight in the windows the way there'd been no lamplight in that house for 11 years before her. I stood outside a minute before going in. Just stood there in the cold looking at my own windows lit up gold, smoke coming straight up out of the chimney into a still sky. And I thought about the man I'd been 5 years before, standing in that same doorway holding a wedge of burnt bread, certain he'd been swindled. I went in. She was at the stove, hair come loose from its pins the way it always did by evening, and she turned when the door banged and looked at me, just looked at me, the particular way she had, like she was taking some kind of inventory and was satisfied with what she found. And she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around me, cold coat and all, mud and ice and everything, and held on. "You're freezing," she said into my shoulder. "Long day." "I kept it warm." "I know you did, smelled it from the yard." She pulled back enough to look up at me, and there wasn't anything dramatic in her face, nothing like in those stories where everything gets said all at once in some big speech. There was just a kind of plain, settled certainty, the look of a woman who is exactly where she means to be. "I used to think," she said, "that you married me out of desperation, same as I married you out of it. 2 desperate people who got lucky neither one ran the other off before the desperation wore off into something else." "Did you?" I said. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" She thought about it the way she thought about most things, careful, not rushing to fill the silence just to fill it. "I think you're the steadiest thing I have ever stood next to," she said. "I think I have burned 1,000 meals in this kitchen, and you never once made me feel small for it, and most men would have. I think you hired me a cook instead of sending me back, and you never said one word about it being a kindness. You just let it be a fact, the way you let everything true just sit there without needing to announce it. I think that's the most I've ever been loved by anybody, Thomas, and it took me 5 years of standing in this kitchen to understand that's what it was." I didn't have a speech to give back. Never had one in me, not then, not now. I just held onto her there in that kitchen with my coat still dripping and the roast going a little past done on the stove because neither of us moved to tend it, and I thought, this is what I wrote that letter to Denver for, even though I didn't know it at the time. Not a cook, not a housekeeper, just this. Somebody who'd stand in a kitchen with me at the end of a hard day and mean it. We stayed on the bar the rest of our lives. Built it up past anything my father left me, past anything I dreamed of as a young man eating standing up at that same stove with my hat still on. We had 2 children who lived and one we didn't, and we buried Mrs. Tavria in the spring of our 9th year together, and Adeline cried harder at that funeral than I'd ever seen her cry, because by then Mrs. Tavria wasn't just the woman who taught her to cook, she was near enough family. Adeline never did burn bread again after that first hard winter. Not once in the 40 years that followed, though every now and then, on an anniversary or some evening when the mood struck her, she'd burn a loaf on purpose, black on the bottom and raw in the middle just like that very first one, and set it on the table without a word, and watch me from across the kitchen to see if I'd remember, and I always did, and I always laughed, and we'd eat good bread instead. The real loaf she'd hidden behind it, and neither one of us ever needed to say what the joke meant. It meant we remembered where we started. It meant neither one of us forgot what it cost us to get to where we ended up. It meant I'd take that burnt first loaf over any fine meal a man could have, because it was the loaf that taught me what a woman's worth looks like when it isn't wrapped up in the thing you thought you were marrying her for. She's out in the kitchen right now, if you want to know. This evening, this very one, gray-headed same as me. And the bread smells fine, the real kind. And I expect she'll come stand in that doorway in a minute the way she has 10,000 evenings before this one. And look at me the particular way she looks at me. And I'll know, same as I've known every one of those 10,000 evenings, that I am the luckiest fool who ever sent a letter off to an agency in Denver hoping for a cook and got instead. The whole rest of his life,